Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Arjun Ramani, who is the Economist Global Business, Technology and Economics correspondent. His economics research on the donut effect of COVID-19 in America's largest cities has been covered by Bloomberg, the Washington Post, and the Economist. He graduated with honors from Stanford University, where he studied economics and computer science, and was a Kennedy Prize winner for Best Undergraduate Thesis. The topic of discussion today is going to be India's economic post-election, impact of AI on India, and possibly AGI. So Arjun, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. It will be great if you could start with sharing an overview on the 6-part report on India's economy that you wrote along with Tom Easton, plus also give an overview of the latest cover on India's election on The Economist, titled A Triumph for Indian Democracy.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Eddie. It's great to be here. So the first was a 6-part special report on the economy, as you mentioned. And I think the goal of this report was basically to explain, the unique macroeconomic model that India is growing under. And then secondly, to lay out what it would take for the country to accelerate growth. So as I'm sure you know, and your listeners probably know, but just to recap the basic facts, India is growing around 6 to 7% annual GDP growth. That's the kind of trend growth rate, and this is roughly in line with what it's been growing at since liberalization. There's the 80s, early 90s. The thing that some people feel though is, why can't this country be growing at 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10% consistently? If you look at China, the East Asian tigers, they all grew at that level for a few decades. That's how they industrialized, got rich quite quickly. And so that was kind of a guiding question for this report. What would it take for India to accelerate growth rates to those levels? And so, the report basically goes over both strengths and weaknesses, and then tries to lay out a reform agenda for the decades ahead. And I think just to start with the strengths, a lot of people know this, but the big shift in the past 10 years or so under the Modi government has been infrastructure. So you've seen, especially in the last few years, a huge increase, a doubling as a percent of GDP from around 2% to 4% in public infrastructure spending. And you actually see there's some continuity here. So the kind of golden quadrilateral infrastructure project that began under Vajpayee, a lot of that's actually being completed under this government. And then you also see it on the digital side, so the digital stack, which I'm sure your listeners know much more than me about. But that's actually quite important for growth, right? Because then you reduce the frictions to commerce over a distance. And importantly, you leave digital trails. So when you do a transaction, it's recorded, and now you have this account aggregator system where you can actually export your financial history and take it to a new lender. And that makes it a lot easier to get access to credit. And this is still in the early days, but I think it's a promising way to provide access to credit when you still have a large population that doesn't have, maybe a formal credit history or credit score, which could boost lending for small businesses and people and so forth. I think those are probably the two biggest ways in which things have improved. I think also the business environment has gotten better. So I think the big reform here has been the GST, the goods and services tax, which I think really has made India a single national market for the first time. It's basically reduced the time it takes for doing customs and duties and so forth, and reconciling tax differences between state borders. And it's gone from weeks to days for some businesses. So that's really made India into a single national market. And so I would say those are the strengths. And I think the common theme throughout, and I think a big part of the report is looking at the political economy, right? How can we connect the politics to the economics? Where does this government do well, and where does it do poorly? And those 3 strengths, I think, are all areas that are ripe for execution. So, the Prime Minister, Modi, some people liken him to a CEO. He's quite good at getting things done when the objectives are clear. I think you can see that in all those 3 areas. In the report, we also have a chapter on weaknesses. I'd say the big weaknesses are really, if you look at the labor market, that's the place to start, where even though the growth rate is around 6 to 7%, only around 100 million people out of the billion or so people of working age population in India have formal jobs, which are salaried and likely to accumulate skills and over time and are exposed to technology. And most people, actually, I think it's 45% right now, are still in agriculture. And then even a lot of people in cities are in informal jobs, unsalaried work and so forth. And I think creating good quality jobs is the big challenge moving forward. And how do you do that? In the report, we go over a number of things, and you can tell me which parts would be most interesting to focus on. But I think just to connect this back to the politics, I think there's a reform agenda in terms of liberalizing India's internal market. So that's the rules and regulations on business operating inside the country. Hasn't fully been completed, even after the liberalization of the 90s. And the reason why, I think, is because a lot of these regulations, things like the labor laws, land laws, agricultural laws, that make it difficult to do business, are things that require cooperation from state governments. So, in India's constitution, you have the union list, you have the state list, you have the concurrent list. And a lot of these domains where there's still a lot of very, very costly red tape on the books are on the state and concurrent lists. And so these are things that the central government can't do without building a consensus with the states. And I think that's where the big weaknesses has been for this government, is finding ways to convince the states to get on board with the economic agenda. We all know there have been lots of tensions with some of the major states and with Delhi over the last 10 years. I think sometimes a strongman style of the government can get in the way of building that consensus. In 2014, they tried to reform land acquisition policies, actually probably a pretty bad idea that came out of the previous government. That was eventually reversed. In 2021, the farm laws were put in place, another generally sensible idea to make agriculture more of a market-based system. And then, of course, that policy was also reversed due to protests. And I think you need to have a different political style to get those types of reforms done. You need to basically do the work of building consensus, getting stakeholders like farms and the states and so forth on board, in order to make sure that the policies can endure and aren't reversed over time. And so I think that's going to be a big challenge for an opportunity for this new government. And that brings me to the second cover story you asked about, which we published just after the election. And I'll be honest, I was surprised with the result. There are many factors behind that, but I think the key point we tried to make in that cover story was, what the economic outlook will look like for the next 5 to 10 years will depend very much on how Prime Minister Modi manages this coalition. Right, it's the first time he's had to govern in a coalition, either at the center or at the state. It's not something he's used to, but actually, we just released a new podcast called the Modi Raj, which my colleague Avantika Chilkoti did. She interviewed something like 100 people who various connections to the prime minister. And what that podcast series, which I would highly recommend, shows is how flexible and adaptable the prime minister is. He's played many roles over the course of his career. So I wouldn't put it past him to completely, basically figure out how to navigate this new governing environment. And I actually am hopeful that because in a coalition, you do have to build consensus with your partners. And I do think, Nitish Kumar and Chandrababu Naidu are generally sensible leaders when it comes to the economy. Hopefully, actually, you get more progress on these reforms, you build an enduring consensus, and you can actually develop better relations with state governments and build that kind of mechanism where the states get on board with the reform agenda. And GST proves it's possible if you have the right leadership. I think Arun Jaitley played a very crucial role in getting GST through. You basically need that process to happen again for a lot of these outstanding reforms. So sorry for joining on, but that's basically the two packages.
Thank you, Arjun, for kind of giving us the complete breakdown on the 6-part report. You spoke about infra, digital stack, business, labor market, something obviously I want to kind of break down on that further, and the ease of business and the issues over there, the difficulty of business over here still in India. So yes, I mean, the election result has definitely dented the overconfident the BJP party and Prime Minister Mr. Modi. Like you mentioned, we have a coalition party, and Chandrababu Naidu doesn't have an anti-minority stance like Prime Minister Modi has. People of India chose not to support the religiously divisive politics, and even shocked BJP in Ayodhya. So what are your thoughts on the potential economic impact of Prime Minister Modi's third term, considering the recent dynamics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're right to point out that in a way, this election result was a rejection of the over centralization, the kind of inflammatory rhetoric. I think in a way, the strategy of the government, one way to describe it, and there are many ways to describe it, was build a massive electoral majority, in part through campaigning on Hindu majoritarianism, and then use that majority to push through your reform agenda, whatever you want to get done on the economic side. And basically, the people of India have pushed back on that. I find that really interesting. And what it means is basically how you build how you get your economic agenda through has to have a different political approach. It's not going to happen through a massive majority and then controlling all the state governments. The idea of double engine government, you control the center, you control the states. I think that idea basically has lost some wind. And the alternative is building the consensus, doing politics in a way, right? Doing politics requires, striking deals, trading favors to an extent, and working with not just coalition parties, but also the opposition and the state governments. And so what is the outlook for the economy? So I think one thing that surprised me is, you probably noticed, the stock market did tank on election day. I think it lost something like 7-8%. The major indices, BSE 500, Sensex. But then it's broadly recovered. It's basically recovered. And actually, that's also been true for some of the stocks that are very tied to the prime minister, Adani Group being probably the number one example, which I think tanked something like 20%. And it's not, I think it's mostly recovered, all those gains, all those losses at last I checked. And what that's suggesting to you is actually there's going to be a lot of continuity. I think if you look at the cabinet selection, right, most of the major economic posts are the same as they were before. So I think this broadly suggests the coalition partners are on board with most of the economic agenda. You're going to see a lot of continuity, actually. There are questions around the industrial policy, whether you really need to be subsidizing all these big firms so much. And I think one thing that's been raised there is whether you need these component tariffs. And so this is something that I've spent a decent amount of time reporting on, which is the industrial policy. Basically, you have a few parts to it. You have the semiconductor mission, which is about $10 billion in chip subsidies. Then you have the PLIs and production-linked incentives, which are basically a $26 billion pot of subsidies for firms that meet certain sales targets. And you get a percentage of your sales back in subsidies. So it's sort of a top-up or an incentive offered to firms as a share of their sales. And obviously, Apple through Foxconn has been a recipient of a lot of this. And I think that's actually one area where it's somewhat succeeded. I think it's been much not really worked actually that well outside of electronics and a little bit of pharmaceuticals. But one thing a lot of these firms have been complaining about is the component tariffs. And actually, if you look at India's external environment from 2014 to 2024, average tariff levels actually increased from about 13% to 18% after a few decades of falling. And so I think that's actually one way in which India stepped backward. But actually, when we talk to people in government and business, there seems to be a growing recognition that the tariffs on components are actually hurting the exporters. It's kind of a strange thing where, you have Foxconn assembling an iPhone in India. And I think last year they assembled 14% of them, the latest iPhones. But they are also importing lots of components from the rest of Asia, but they're paying a tariff on this. So you're giving them a subsidy and then they're paying you back through the tariffs. And I think the government starting to realize this. In the last budget, they cut component tariffs from 15% to 10%. I'm hopeful that will continue, but we'll see. With the coalition, the pace at which these things can get through will slow down, and hopefully that increases the quality of the decisions and increases the likelihood that they endure over time and aren't reversed. But I think that's where there is some uncertainty. But just to recap, right, the fact that markets have actually basically come back to their pre-existing levels suggests that there's probably going to be more continuity than disruption.
Your report claims that India's economy will experience a good near-term performance, but may face challenges in the long term. Can you elaborate on that? And how do you see India address issues like income inequality and poverty in the context of the rapidly evolving technological landscape today?
I think that's right. The outlook for the short to medium term is quite positive. The outcome for the longer term is much more uncertain. Just starting with the short-term outlook, the forecast is something like 6.5% growth for the next 5 or so years. Goldman Sachs, IMF, generally in that range, and I think that's nothing to be sneered at, right? The global economy has slowed down. It's growing at less than 3% a year. So in comparison, India is a relative bright spot, and I think the reason the longer term outlook is more uncertain is basically two big buckets. The first is the reform agenda that we were talking about. So, a big part of this is things like labor laws, land laws, the agricultural reform that still is mired with a lot of red tape and subsidy. Just to give one example of, we talked about the labor laws. This is something where some people have started to say that maybe this doesn't actually matter that much, right? Because a lot of firms in manufacturing have found ways around various restrictions and are simply hiring people on contract. And so one of the most infamous labor laws is this Factories Act, which if you're a factory and you have over 100 people in some states, over 300 in others, you have to get government permission before you can fire anyone. And on its face, this seems like a good labor-friendly thing, but actually the kind of negative side effect is then firms don't grow as much. They above a certain level, above that threshold, they'll basically stop hiring and they'll prefer contract labor. And one of the challenges with that is then firms don't invest as much in skills and human capital. And because if your worker is only seasonal and they're leaving halfway through the year, then you might have less of an incentive. And so this is one of the reasons why I think India is less competitive in labor-intensive sectors like textiles. It's actually losing out to Bangladesh right now, and its exports are actually falling in real terms. And we talked about agricultural reform, right? The farm laws. Getting these things done is a big uncertainty. We've been talking about this stuff for decades. It's most of the advisors, economists on both sides of the political spectrum, generally have a sense that this is what needs to be done. But it does require a lot of very, very skilled politics, which we haven't quite seen from this government yet on those thorny issues. So I think that's the big uncertainty. Decentralization is another one. So if you look at cities, which is where growth is going to come from, a lot of people don't realize this, but India is actually majority urban now. Over half the population in urban areas, if you properly define urban areas. If you look at the official data from the government, you'll still think the population is, over 65% rural. But that's just because the boundaries haven't been updated in over a decade, right? So it turns out that actually most of the population is now in urban areas, but cities are still governed by the state governments, by the chief ministers. We had the 73rd and 74th Amendments of the Constitution in I think the early 90s, but they haven't really, and they were supposed to, devolve power, decentralize power from states to cities and other parts of the third tier, but it just hasn't happened in mass. I think that's going to be a big, big challenge in terms of improving the quality of infrastructure, public services, and so forth, so cities can become engines of growth. Again, another issue where a lot of people economists, thinkers, so forth, generally agree, but the politics are very difficult. And so there's a lot of uncertainty over when, if at all, it'll get done. So that's one reason why I'm more concerned about the long run. The other reason has to do with the global economy. I just think growth has become more challenging. So I recently interviewed Danny Roderick for a story I'm working on, who's an economist at Harvard who studies industrialization and growth. And he basically made the point that the ceiling on growth, the cap on growth, your potential is probably lower now for a developing country than it was in the late 20th century. And so it's just much harder to grow fast. And the reason is because manufacturing is much more competitive than it used to be. It's much more automated. And And the world trade environment is less friendly, right? So if you look at trade and manufactured goods as a share of world GDP, it's basically stalled since about 2008. This means that rather than trading into a growing market, which is what China had and what Korea had, India is trying to export into a stagnant market for manufactured goods, which is not as favorable. There's also the labor required for manufacturing is also much more skilled. It's a much more capital intensive sector, which means that emerging economies that historically have had the advantage of low cost labor, that's less of an advantage. So China still has around 42% of global manufacturing employment, over half of output in a lot of major sectors. And I think there's this idea that manufacturing is going to just naturally leave China and go to other countries that have lower labor costs. But that's just happening very, very slowly. And I think the reason why is because, one, China is subsidizing manufacturing still. And secondly, because, as mentioned, manufacturing is more capital intensive. And so it's possible for a richer country like China now at $12.5 thousand a year in GDP per capita to still be a manufacturing powerhouse. And so I just think that makes it harder to get richer faster. And so you have to pioneer new approaches. And so India has a big services export sector, right? If you look at IT services, these global capability centers and so forth, nearly 10% of GDP in services exports a year. That's massive. But it doesn't provide that many jobs. And still services exports are only a third as big as manufactured exports. So, I mean, services exports are a growing opportunity, but it's not yet as big of an sector as manufacturing is, or it was back in the 90s. So that's generally why the outlook, I think, is a bit uncertain.
Right. And I think you rightfully pointed out, I think we're living in a world which is becoming more and more competitive. So growth is definitely going to be more and more challenging because you said it's becoming more competitive. Things are being automated. The global trade environment is not so friendly. India definitely leads the software industry, but hardware is still kind of lagging behind. And I'm going to try and kind of pick holes into the present government's, the kind of functioning, because I want to kind of go step back in time, like the demonetization, I thought it was like a failure. The idea behind it was to kind of bring back the black money. So, but I kind of didn't understand, why they introduced larger currency notes such as 2000. Then COVID happened, and then the stimulus package was somewhere around 20 lakh crore. And unlike in America, where, the government went and actually kind of distributed the stimulus fund amongst the people, I think the Indian government went the other way around. It was distributed to the banks and the big companies, while the common man and the small enterprises, they just got these loans. That's about it. So the government agenda seems to be empowering just the infra and the business, but has largely been overlooking the common man. The wealth inequality in India has grown, with the richest 1% holding 40% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% holds just about 6%. So while the GDP is growing, which is very, very cool, but what do you think about India's per capita income, which seems to be sliding? And what do you think could be done to kind of reverse this trend?
So first of all, I fully agree that that's a weakness of the current model, which is it's imbalanced growth, right? It's driven, the leading sector is this, IT services, tech exports, and so forth. And you do have some large corporations that are doing well elsewhere, pharmaceuticals, for example, but broad-based growth has not come yet. And you see that in figures like consumption growth, where consumption growth is very closely linked to wage growth. And it's growing at something like 2 to 3% a year if you compare the last two consumption surveys, which isn't the best way to measure this, but it's all we have. And so that suggests that the gains of growth are not trickling down. We mentioned 45% of the population still employed in agriculture. You would expect that to be changing much more rapidly if the economy were creating high quality formal jobs in manufacturing and services in the cities, but that's not happening. I think it's partly a puzzle. I mean, it partly comes back to what I said earlier about manufacturing being much harder. Manufacturing has historically been the labor intensive sector that absorbs, your rural population in. But because that's a challenge now, it's becoming more of an imbalanced growth model. I don't fully blame the government for that. I think that's partly due to just how the global economy has changed. But I do agree with you. There are areas where they haven't addressed this weakness adequately. I think you're absolutely right. Demonetization was a big blunder. And we see that in the share of cash that was returned. It was over, I think, well over 99%, suggesting that the large companies with a lot of black money, I think what they did was they basically asked their employees, or they got large numbers of people to basically divvy up their big piles of cash into small amounts, and then they're basically able to turn all their black money into white money. And so basically people were able to get around demonetization. And really what it did was it caused a lot of hardship for small and medium sized enterprises and poor people who are mostly still cash based. On the COVID response, I think you're absolutely right. The lockdown, a lot of it was bungled. A lot of people don't talk about this anymore, but if you look to the early reports, it was quite draconian. It was actually much harsher for a longer period of time than a lot of the rest of the world. People were out of school well into 2021 and some parts into 2022. And school attendance rates still haven't fully recovered. So I actually think that's going to be the biggest cost of the COVID lockdowns is on learning for kids who didn't go back, who lost multiple years of education. I do think the welfare support is maybe one area where I would push back slightly. Where while I agree that broadly the policy environment, it is favored towards the formal corporate sector, a lot of big companies. There is a lot of welfare expansion over the past 5-10 years. So you see the Swachh Bharat building out the toilets, and I know a lot of them haven't been maintained, but open defecation rates have fallen. You see, the cooking gas cylinders, running water, electricity has improved, and then actually just direct benefit transfers. So this is just because with the Jandhan scheme, most households have bank accounts that are linked to Aadhaar. You can just send the DBT straight to people's bank accounts for a lot of these schemes, especially in rural areas. And I think that's actually one way in which India has improved the efficiency of the welfare system is through these direct benefit transfers. And so you have, PSN for farmers, you have the free grain for, the majority of the population now can get free grain, and that's been extended. And so there, in a way you can kind of, if you put all these pieces together, you have a picture where the economic growth is very imbalanced. You're not creating large numbers of formal jobs, but you've made the welfare systems a little bit more efficient using technology as a way of, alleviating the pain from the lack of job growth. And I don't think this is the ideal solution, but it's sort of the equilibrium that the Indian economy has fallen under.
Right. Arjun, artificial intelligence, I think the world is completely transformed, because the first time in history, we got a technology which is self-learning of sorts, and what it's doing now, it's pretty much magical. I mean, though this is like, it's what it does is basically, data in, data out. The kind of data is kind of ingesting, is throwing out these awesome kind of, inferring, your text to images, design, music, video, code, and so on and so forth. How do you see AI kind of transforming India, and how do you think India can leverage AI for economic development?
I do agree with your broad point that AI is a huge opportunity, and I will give my analysis on how it's going to affect India. But the first thing I would say is I do think AI has been, dare say it, slightly overhyped in the short term. And I think in the long term, it will have a big impact. But I think in the short term, people are talking about, AGI. I have a lot of friends who work in various labs like OpenAI and DeepMind, and there are a lot of people who think we're going to get to something like human level of intelligence within the decade. We're going to be in a post-work society, automate everything. And, I don't want to rule anything out. The world has surprised us before, but in the short to medium term, I'm quite skeptical. A very interesting survey the US Census Bureau does every 2 weeks. They just survey, tens of thousands of firms on whether they've incorporated AI into their operations. And actually the trend line is very, very slowly trickling up. The numbers shocked me. It was around 5 to 6% of firms that are using AI into operation. So the diffusion of technology actually takes a long time, and we can know this from history, where it took decades for even switch operators for telephones to be automated, even when they could. There are lots of things in our world right now that could be automated, but they're not because the world changes rather slowly. Anyway, so with that context or caveat, I do think in the long run it's a big deal, and I think the opportunity for India, I think, is in several areas. So the first thing that I just was reading about this earlier, it's quite important, I think, is data center capital expenditure build out in India is huge right now. So a lot of people don't know this, but actually something like there are 1,600 global capability centers in India right now. These are basically the India offices for foreign multinational firms, tech firms. So Amazon's biggest office is in India. Goldman Sachs' second biggest office. Those 1,600 GCCs, I think they employ about 3.2 million people, generating over $100 billion in annual revenues exports, which is huge, right? And that's all happened in just a few decades. And because of that huge presence that these foreign firms have, these tech firms have in India, they have huge employee bases, big offices, and they're not just doing back office work. They're increasingly moving into higher value add tasks. 20% of the world's semiconductor design engineers are in India now. A lot of them do R&D, file patents. It makes sense for these big tech firms to have data center capacity in India because the knowledge talent, the human capital is here as well. And so actually, I think outside of America, India over the next decade is basically expected to have the most data center capital expenditure of any country, and sans China. And within the Southeast Asia sphere, the projections are well and away India is gonna be number one on this. And so I think that's a pretty big opportunity because then you have a huge amount of local compute where you can run experiments, you generate high value add employment, and there are a lot of positive externalities from that. So that's number one is on the compute capacity. The other side of things is actual AI model companies, and here's where I'm a bit more uncertain because you have companies like Sarvam AI, which is funded by Peak 15, formerly Sequoia. You have Krutrim, which Bhavish Agarwal. You have Reliance now saying they're getting into AI, and so you have a few interesting initiatives. And I think there is an opportunity here, especially with language, right? In terms of making language models better at Indic languages. I think Sarvam has an open source model called OpenHati, where they've taken various open source models and made them better at Hindi and Tamil, and they've actually even used for Hindi the Devanagari script, and so that's an advantage. But whether these companies can actually compete with the global players, with Google, with Microsoft and Meta, I think is far from certain. And basically, if you think about where is the value capture going to occur, in your AI stack, you have the chips, then you have the cloud providers, you have the model builders like OpenAI, Google, and then you have the application builders. And thus far, India is really just operating at the application layer. And the worry is that the application layer doesn't actually capture that much of the value. If you look at what's happened so far, it's basically entirely gone to the chip providers and the cloud players. Like NVIDIA is the largest company in the world now by market cap, which is amazing, extraordinary rise. And it's not actually just because of an expansion of the multiple. Their net earnings, their revenues both have actually kept up. And then, of course, the cloud providers, their revenues are going up. You see OpenAI now, there is a recent report from The Information that 3.4 billion in annualized recurring revenue. So, the first three layers, there's clearly money. It's unclear whether the application layer actually captures that much value. And if you look at the past wave of software and consumer investing in India, there were successful companies that came out of it. But for the most part, where there was a Western player, they were basically able to scale into the Indian market and capture most of the value. And so, the base case is probably that happens to AI as well. And I think it's going to be a challenge for India to basically capture more of that value. I do think, on applications, there is some interesting stuff that could happen. And I think the most interesting stuff is actually incorporating AI into the existing companies. So I think IT services and GCCs actually have a big opportunity here. So if you look at, Infosys, TCS, all the multinational firms in the world now need to incorporate AI into their operations. Who's going to do that for them? They don't have the engineering capacity internally. And so a lot of them are actually just turning to these Indian IT firms to help them incorporate AI. And so I actually think that's a big opportunity.
Right, right. So I can completely double you on, the way that India has taken its approach. They're largely building apps rather than the entire stack. So yeah, but I'm going to kind of try and push back because I completely understand, what you said about, the AI short term. It's been a little overhyped, and the diffusion of tech takes a long time. But, ChatGPT grew to 100 million users in just 2 months after its launch, which is the fastest growth for any app, So I think that the world has completely changed. Yes, I completely do understand. It's a business strategy to kind of push back and hype AI, and that's how the world has completely been. In awe of AI. I think everybody is using. My 9-year-old boy is hooked onto AI, and he's using that, and I think the growth is going to be much faster because I think the world dynamics has completely changed. Is my assumption. Would love to kind of get your views on that. And talking about the labor market, the world, it was promised that AI will be doing the hard jobs, the laundry, the dishes, and etc. And we would be doing the art, music, and writing, and so on, so on, and so forth. But the AI today is doing the art, the songs, the videos, the creatives, and we are left doing the hard work. So AI does today, everything like earlier said, text to image, text to video, text to design, text to game building, and AI is automating jobs also. There's been Zhengdong Wang, and then there's so many others who saying that possibly, coding is going to get redundant. So AI is automating, quite a lot of jobs, and then there's India Employment Report 2024 by the International Labour Organization talks about the unemployment crisis in India in length, right from the Education Institute, it seems is not skilling the students for the new jobs that are there. The unemployment rate in India rose to 8.1% in April 2024 from 7.4% in March 2024. And according to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. So how do you see this existing unemployment crisis and AI job loss gonna impact India's workforce? Because I see some sort of like a double whammy of sorts. What are your thoughts on that?
Both really interesting questions. So just quickly on the diffusion question, and then I'll get to the labor market. So I agree with you. The growth of ChatGPT was extraordinary. The thing I will just caveat that with is you have to look at consumers versus enterprise. So consumer adoption was very fast, but it's very unclear how much of that translates to productivity growth. Enterprise adoption has been slow. And I think the proof is in the productivity growth statistics. And so that's something we track very closely. I don't think you can actually show there's any evidence of a productivity acceleration in terms of output per man hour as a result of AI. If you look at productivity growth for most economies in the world, it is still below its pre-pandemic trend. So COVID has left lasting scars, and AI has not been able to correct for that. America is one exception where it's gotten back to its pre-pandemic trend, but it's not at all gotten beyond it. It could change, very open to that, but I would just caution from drawing too many insights about the macroeconomic impact from just how much we're using it every day. On the labor market, really tough question because in a sense it's sort of a puzzle, right? How is India growing at 6-7% supposedly, and then it also has an 8% unemployment rate, as you said, but then even more important than the unemployment rate is the underemployment, right? Lots of people in kind of informal jobs are earning not very good salaries. How do you ensure that the labor market is tight, and how can you have this dichotomy? I think part of this goes back to what we talked about with manufacturing earlier, where the labor intensive sector is not doing well. It's these services sector, service exports that are doing well, and it's not trickling down fast enough. And you mentioned that historically we thought that AI was going to automate things like laundry and kind of things in the physical world, the hard jobs, but it actually seems to be coming for the cognitive class. Maybe me and you it'll be AI is having this conversation in the future. I actually think parts of that are and give it sufficient time is a real risk to think about. We talked about IT services. A lot of these jobs, building basic programs, et cetera, are things that you might imagine in the future. A multinational corporation just asks GPT-8 to make them a new website or to help them do their cloud transition. I don't think it's a major risk in the short run, but certainly in the medium to long run. I mean, you can also already see actually on online freelancing platforms for very, very simple jobs like writing marketing copy or translation, employment has actually already fallen on these platforms like Upwork and Fiverr and so forth. So I think, as to your point, there already is some automation. In terms of the longer term outlook, so historically, if you look at agriculture, for example, most humans were working in farms in rich countries, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And lots of people were, after Industrial Revolution, lots of people working in textiles. In every wave of automation, there are people who worry that there will be no jobs remaining. In fact, in a way that already happened, right? Because if 60, 70% of your population was in agriculture in 18th century, America or England or something, I don't know if that's the exact number, but roughly in that vicinity. And today it's less than 1% in America, right? So you created so many new industries and things for people to do. I don't see any reason why AI is going to be different. And the reason is because there's so many parts of the economy as you get richer that very, very much depend on in-person context and humans essentially doing the job. So you can think of education, where a big part of teaching is not actually just transmission of content. I can go listen to a lecture any day, but why do I prefer doing interviews and talking to people? Because it's dynamic, because it's engaging. And actually for students, it's much more motivating to have a teacher that cares about them, right? If a teacher cares about you, you're much more likely to do your homework than if it's a robot telling you to do it. So I think, education is a massive sector where, yes, we already have videos and online learning that's probably better than most teachers, but you still have humans doing teaching because there's something very social and personal about motivation and pedagogy. Healthcare is another example where people are much more likely to trust a human doctor that they've built a relationship with. And I actually have a friend in Delhi. His name is Shurjit Nandi. He has a company called Raxa, which is building one of these AI healthcare helpers, and it can help doctors and patients do better prescription. But I view it in the medium term, at least, as more of a complement than a substitute. And then, of course, there are lots of sectors where even when AI is better than humans, you still see huge amounts of human labor involved. So sports, esports, entertainment, all great examples where even though AI is superhuman at chess, for example, people still play it competitively. Video games, esports is a growing market, tens of billions of dollars globally and rising very, very quickly. And then, lots of stuff in the physical world, right? Robotics progress, lags language model progress tremendously. So I think, there's lots and lots of stuff to do in the physical world. The last thing I'll just note with AI and language models is, we're still trying to figure out what language models really are even doing. And I encourage listeners who are interested in kind of getting into the computer science behind this to listen to a guy named Francois Chollet. He's a researcher at Google. And he has a very, very good explanation of what language models are doing and what they're not doing. And he basically doesn't think they're actually intelligent in the same way that humans are, though they are obviously very capable, because they don't learn dynamically on the fly. And so if you look at parts of the economy which are constantly changing and that are responding to what humans do, I think financial markets are a great example, because when you are a trader or an investor, when you invest in something, that changes the price. And it actually changes the economy. And so even if you can use a machine, an AI, to do the investing, the world is going to respond. And so it turns out it's very, very difficult to automate trading. And even though there's tons of data, and it's very, very machine compatible, it's actually very few, there are basically no trading firms that are fully automated. Even the ones that run lots of quantitative strategies, they still have humans in the loop to monitor and update algorithms. And that's because the world is dynamic, it's constantly changing. And so I think that's where another place where humans will still have a lot of relevance for the medium term. And then, if we do get super intelligence, obviously, all bets are off, but we'll see.
Right. Yeah. So I hope that the humans always stay in the loop, but let's assume for once, that we are 10 years into the future. We are in 2034. And the rate at which AI is accelerating, and it's not just AI. There's a convergence of technologies. Because it's not just AI. It's Web3, it's metaverse. And you spoke about the physical world. But then there's this there's a group of people, companies building these virtual worlds. Virtual worlds which eventually someday could be indistinguishable from reality. I personally have been invested in metaverses, and we building these virtual worlds. Which where you can interact, socialize, watch content, create content, experience content, or also AI personalized learning. So if we kind of take the rate at which AI is growing, because even today, there is these co-pilots and tech stack which does text to code and so on and so forth. What do you think 2034 is gonna look like? What are there going to be any jobs? And what's going to be the role of money over there? You think maybe in a world where if AI is taking over all the jobs, would universal basic income come to play over there? Would love to hear your thoughts about on the money, UBI, and a world 10 years later.
Yeah. And I take your point fully. And maybe I would not say it's 10 years, maybe it's more like 20 or 30, but directionally, we're headed to a world where more and more work is, fused with technology. Categories getting automated. One macro trend that sort of motivates or supports what you're suggesting is just working hours. If you look at the number of working hours per week for the average person, over the past 200 years, it's basically, I think, fallen from around 60 to now closer to 35 in most of the Western world. And as countries get richer, people do work less, right? And they spend a lot more time on leisure. And so, and if social safety nets have grown, right? Most of these countries have, large socialized healthcare, or at least government-funded healthcare systems. Education is largely, at least up till college, is taken care of. You have Social Security, you have lots of benefits for the unemployed and so forth. Whether it takes the form of a UBI, I'm very uncertain of. You could imagine it's instead, people don't work very much, but they do something for 5 to 10 hours a week. And it just pays you a lot of money because there's just so much wealth floating around that, being singing, playing a concert, for example, or being a teacher, the salaries for these things just go up massively because people value, for some share of their life, the human connection rather than the AI. But you can also imagine that just a lot of jobs genuinely do get totally automated, and lots of people don't have the skills to do these, the jobs that do remain for humans. And in that case, you might need more social support, you might need a UBI. And I actually think, going back to what you were saying earlier on India, with the employment report, I think that's partly what's a kind of early version of that might be already happening, right? We talked about we have the rural employment guarantee with Manrega, we have the direct benefit transfers, we have the free grain, because the skill level of a lot of the population is not high enough to get the jobs that you would hope for, or the competitiveness of the internal economy because of things like infrastructure and trade policy or whatever isn't good enough to generate the high quality jobs. You've basically settled for the second best world, and maybe a world of super AI. You also need a lot of these transfers to ensure that people can maintain their standard of living. I don't want to write that off America, they have this policy called the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's not quite a UBI, but it's basically a wage top up. So it's basically a negative income tax, effectively. So you get more money even if you have a job that doesn't pay that well. So you could imagine more tools like that being used to support people. So yeah, I think the world will change enormously. Exactly the form it takes, I'm not so sure of, but we'll see. What do you think will happen?
So I think there's so many dynamics, Arjun. It's so very difficult to comprehend, and maybe the speculations are just going to be speculations. But there are so many things at play. And there is a convergence of technology of sorts. There is AI, and AI itself. I think there's various approaches. There are a bunch of team who think large language models are the way to get to AGI. Then there's these others who think brain inspired is possibly a way to get to AGI. Then besides AI, I think there's this decentralization tech, which is Web 3.0. I think once that kind of breaks through, I think the entire top-down hierarchical system of the world is going to get disrupted. I can't fathom what the world would look like when we actually understand decentralization, because I think we talk about decentralization, but I don't think we are ready for decentralization whatsoever, because all our businesses, from our institutions to your banks to your governments, it's top-down hierarchical. What happens once it truly gets decentralized? Even currently, AI is automating slowly and steadily all our jobs. I think in the 10 years time, 15 years time, it could create a big impact over there, and a huge percent of the jobs are gonna go. And I think it's not just the tech. I think there's another dynamic that we are not really looking at, which is climate crisis. I believe that the rate at which we are consuming without conservation is killing our world slowly. So the climate crisis is something that I don't think anybody understands, and everybody is overlooking. No matter how much the UN says it's a code red for humanity, or 11,000 climate scientists who said that we've kind of crossed a 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think we are in a race to nowhere with the larger how a sea is profit at any cost. So maybe I'm ranting, but I don't really know what the world is going to look like in a 15 to 20 years horizon, because I think we are in an AI arms race. I think everybody is running towards developing something which is human level intellect, whatever you might want to call it, AGI or whatever. And there's a definite race towards that. There is Microsoft, there's Google, then there's nations who are at it. There's US, there's China, and everybody is going inwards. I think we need to go a little outwards, where we need to involve everybody. We need to connect and find out that, okay, the AI that is being trained on currently is being trained on a shitty, divisive, racially divided data. And it's like a species of sorts that we are kind of building. It's learning from a shitty data. What's it going to learn? So I think if we get to AGI through whatever approach, it's going to be disruptive. There is virtual reality, that we are building virtual worlds, which is even today. These virtual reality games are so potential. It kind of tricks your motor cortex into believing the virtual is real. What happens in a 15 years timeline once we kind of understand or brain, and then maybe instead of kind of giving you a headset, we kind of insert a chip and kind of put you into a virtual world. So maybe I've gone a little dystopian, but I think the world in another 15-20 years, with the dynamics of climate change, with the dynamics of AI turning into AGI, with a centralized AGI, is going to be something which I don't think humanity is kind of ready for, because we as a species don't understand conscious capitalism. I think we create an innovation And we think it solves a problem, but it creates another problem. We don't understand circular economy. So we as a race are, I think, slowly, one step at a time, we are killing ourselves. And we don't even understand that. So yeah, maybe yeah. So I want to get into a little bit of. I'm not going to take much time of yours. Maybe two questions. I want to get your views on cryptocurrency. Because Deloitte had conducted a global blockchain survey back in 2021, and the majority of the financial professionals that they interviewed believed that cryptocurrencies will either replace or rival, fiat currencies within, the next 5 or 10 years. Here in India, we are obviously UPI is a game changer. We hardly transact in fiat. It's all digital, but that too is centralized. As an economist, what's your view on centralized versus decentralized currency? And do you see tokens ever replacing or rivaling, fiat?
Okay, I will get to that. I just want to quickly touch on some things you mentioned on your future of speculation because it was very interesting, and I do have lots of thoughts on crypto. So first thing to just mention, you mentioned every time you solve a problem with technology, you might create new ones. I think that's interesting because that also creates new things to do. So a recent paper that I was reading, this is from David Otter and a few others at MIT in Boston, they find that since 1940, the vast majority of jobs that we currently are doing are things that didn't exist then. So they're all new jobs. Thinking about designing a solar panel, for example, you mentioned climate change. There are going to be so many jobs involved in the green transition. On your point on decentralization, I think that's going to be critical. Even with how India is governed, right? Giving more autonomy to localities, to cities, and so forth, and letting the best ideas bubble up rather than always feeling that we need to have top-down control. I think that's a general principle that's helped a lot of countries grow. China actually, I think a lot of people don't know this, but it's remarkably decentralized in how it's governed. It's very, very top-down in terms of final control. The CCP at the center obviously has control over the country. But in terms of day-to-day administration and governance and rulemaking, what they do is they set the general priority, and then all the cities and provinces and so forth, autonomous regions throughout the country, then get to choose how they want to meet those broad, high-level objectives. And you actually get a lot of competition between the cities as a result, which, there are economic studies that find that this was a big reason behind rapid Chinese growth. One part I am more pessimistic about is the nationalism the AI nationalism that you had mentioned. Nationalism is a good thing. You want pride in your country, but when it gets excessive and it leads to turning inwards and it leads to lack of international cooperation, it can get dangerous. And I worry that we are headed in that role. You mentioned sovereign AI models. This is propping up everywhere. It's a big motivation for these chip subsidies. And you're getting a lot of duplication of effort, right? You're getting a lot of wasteful production because people are basically doing the same work that other people are doing. And I think there's basically, in the mindset in the White House, a lot of this is just driven by U.S.-China relations, to be honest, and U.S.-Russia relations. And there's a mindset that cooperation is impossible and we're in an arms race. And I think we should recognize the reality that tensions are higher, and there are fundamental differences between, the West, Russia, and China, and how the world should operate. But there are also especially between America and China, lots of areas of mutual agreement, such as on climate change and the green transition. And so, basically, the plea is to not view everything as a binary or a false dichotomy. There are lots of intermediate stages. And I think the sophisticated thinkers know this, but I worry the public rhetoric treats China as evil without realizing they're a complex country like everyone else. AI and brains in the virtual world. I don't know about this. I mean, to be honest, I personally get headaches when I put on the VR headsets. I really like the Apple Vision Pro though. Maybe this tells you something about human nature, how much we're willing to be in digital worlds versus in-person physical worlds. I do think it's quite striking though that all the tech CEOs, they kind of have very, very harsh restrictions on their kids, on their usage of technology. And I think, there's also, the Surgeon General in the US just issued a warning on social media as bad for mental health. So I actually think we might be in the middle of a correction on overdependence on technology right now, which is somewhat optimistic. Okay, I'll pause there. Cryptocurrency. So your question was, could they replace and rival fiat in 5 to 10 years. Is that right? Or what's the role of cryptocurrency in the future?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing I will just say is, UPI is not a crypto, as you mentioned. It's centralized, and it is also fiat currency, right?
Right.
What is fiat currency? It's anything where the government, the central bank, is the final backer for the value of that currency. They're willing to accept it as payment and taxation. They recognize it as legal tender, and the system of banking is regulated, and UPI runs on top of the banking system, right? You're really just doing, it's a layer, that it's a protocol that allows you to send money from one bank to another. I will be completely honest with you. I'm pretty bearish on decentralized cryptocurrencies. I think they will play a role. We see Bitcoin basically playing the role of digital gold, where it's it offers some portfolio diversification. It's worth a decent amount of money. And it's going to stay. It's not going to go away. And it's used by people in countries with inflating fiat currencies. It's used, for money laundering, to be honest, in some cases. It's used when you basically want to transact outside of the purview of the government, of the state. And that is what crypto really offers as an advantage. A decentralized cryptocurrency is, finding a way to transact outside of the eye of the state. That has its uses. I think a lot of governments in the world are not always doing the best things. A lot of them are quite bad. It's probably a good thing to have this as an option. But I think, most societies hopefully are in the long run trend towards a place where the state is legitimate, and we find a balance between privacy and state control and regulation. Crypto is very rarely used for real economic activity in Western economies, for example. I don't think that's going to change in 5 to 10 years. And the fundamental reason is because governments have a legitimate interest in the financial system and having some degree of control over it. It's a lever you can use to prevent crime. It's also a way in which you conduct fiscal and monetary policy, right? So recessions and business cycles are much rarer and less costly now than they were before the invention of central banking. Recessions were much more common in the 19th century, 18th century. Business cycles were much deeper and longer. I think central banking and monetary policy is an amazing invention that's basically helped the world become a much better place, and that depends on some degree of government control over the currency. So that's what I think about decentralized crypto. That said, there are a role for blockchains. There are a lot of interesting applications for blockchains. I don't actually think many of them are proven in practice yet, but I'll just speculate on one that seems interesting to me, that becomes more important in the age of AI, which is data ownership. So all these models are trained on tons of data, and we have a concept in a lot of legal systems called fair use. Fair use meaning that even if something is copyrighted, so like The Economist as a newspaper is copyrighted, but you can still read The Economist and cite me in a podcasting conversation, right? And The Economist can't sue you for it because that's fair use. It's a legitimate transformation usage of that content. Otherwise, the knowledge economy would break down. It would just be too complicated. AI models are a bit different. Some people would say they're not. The labs are basically saying that when they train on all of the data in the world, whether it's this podcast conversation that me and you are having, or a newspaper or a textbook, that's fair use. The AI is learning about the world just like a human would. And to an extent, that's sort of true. But I think the challenge is, Benedict Evans, who's a famous technology writer, he has this idea that a difference in scale can lead to a difference in principle. And so when AI models are doing this at scale, and they are effectively able to become, close to perfect substitutes for consuming the original content itself, and that obviously could hurt the revenues and the livelihoods of people who are producing the content, then you run into a bigger challenge. And I have a friend named Jason Zhao. He runs a crypto startup called Story Protocol that's A16Z backed. And he has this a metaphor of a snake eating its own tail, where the AI model, by substituting for the content providers, it's eating its own tail because that's the training data for it to get better in the future. And so we have to think about what is the right economic market structure where both the original primary data producers, people like me and you, get compensated, but the AI labs and the models are also able to thrive. And the economics of that, I think, could be an interesting place for blockchains where, you have some kind of micropayment that's happening every time someone, references this conversation or an article that I've written in the response to a question that you ask an AI model. This is particularly useful for RAG, for retrieval augmented generation, when you're looking at, you're ingesting a bunch of documents and then you're producing your response based on those documents. And maybe you do some kind of micropayment, and the property rights and the terms for how you facilitate this kind of transaction are all on blockchains. And I can choose to, I can put, I can say, oh, all articles produced by Arjun are going to be on this protocol, this blockchain, and you can use it for every time you use it, you have to pay me this much. And then all those negotiations happen seamlessly or with very, very little friction. We don't need to go and find a lawyer and negotiate the terms and so forth. That happens very seamlessly. That's one example of where I could see maybe the kind of two worlds meeting together. I don't know if that's going to work. It's maybe needlessly complex. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, cool. So Arjun, I'm just gonna, you mentioned about these AR, VR glasses, and how you feel that there's going to be some kind of a correction, because I think I double you on that. I think we've come to a point where I think there's going to be a breakout, possibly a faction, group, people who are going to be maybe anti-technology. Because I see that, that growing narrative, that, kids should be off the screen and so on and so forth. But I think through the history, if you've seen, we humans have continuously augmented, there has been a specific technology stack, and we've resisted that, just for the healthcare perspective, from the IVF or so many others, there's been resistance. But today, I think, there's so many IVF kids. And I think you mentioned about the glasses, I think it's even the Apple Vision Pro is still in its very rudimentary stage, because I think, when virtual reality completely kind of grows, I think it'll be possibly much, much lighter than this. And if we kind of converge that with like brain computer interfaces, and that will be like maybe you will be, it's definitely not a very great place to be in, but I think the technology that we are growing, every technology has this thing. It's so cool in this immediate term, but in the long term, it gets scary. I think it's with all computer, all technology, whether it's nanotechnology, AI, virtual reality. In the near term, it's very, very cool, but in the long term, I think most of the tech stack, I'm not saying that it's going to be completely bad, but yes, I think if it's not directed now consciously to benefit humanity, which I don't see happening because of a race to build technology, with profit at any cost ethos. So I see that it's going to be not so very cool future. Would love to hear your thoughts on what the next 10-year of India looks like. In the terms of the economic growth and so on and so forth. That's my last question to you.
Okay. Yeah. Just to wrap up the AR VR thing, I could totally imagine it, augmenting humans' interactions with the world in the future, especially as the hardware gets more efficient and lightweight. I think you're right that we have to think about how to keep the human experience at the center of it. Yeah, I'm very uncertain how that will play out. Because if you look at the share of time we spend on screens, that has kind of consistently increased
Exactly.
as they have developed. And then you can imagine this is another, form factor in which we
completely immersive, completely experiential, where you have all your senses, not just sight, sound, but touch, smell, taste also, but because that's what a virtual reality is going to, true virtual reality is going to give.
Yeah, exactly. So on the next 10 years for
next
India,
5 years, possibly this term.
5 years.
Yeah.
Sure. I think the base case is, as mentioned, India will keep growing 6-7% a year. It's the world's fifth biggest economy now. I think by 2027, 28, it'll be number three. It's going to become more important to the global economy, especially on the services side. So you'll see more and more high value add services shift to India. Basically, you can do a straight labor arbitrage, where you get a lower cost engineer in India as opposed to hiring someone in the West. And in most cases, you can find someone who's just or even more talented. I think the big question is when, speaking about the tech sector, when India will be able to take this sort of human capital expertise it's developed in IT and also these GCCs, the Global Capability Centers, which are effectively services foreign direct investment, right? It's foreign firms investing in India, bringing technology, investing in people here, and whether they're able to convert that to India born firms. And this is sort of like what happened to China in the late 20th century and early 21st century, where it had huge inflows of foreign direct investment, and actually a lot of the East Asian tigers. These foreign companies employ large amounts of labor in the population. They skilled up, they learned a lot, technology was diffused, and then eventually you saw Chinese companies and Korean companies get born that ended up in some cases becoming quite significant in global markets. So in China's case, like BYD is the number one example right now for electric vehicles, where the manufacturing supply chain in China was largely built, or in many cases built by foreign companies coming in, bringing in their production processes. Then Chinese people learned how that worked, and then eventually they were able to start their own firms. You have a lot of R&D as well, and now you have world-class firms. BYD is probably the best manufacturer of electric vehicles in the world. Some people think it's even better than Tesla in terms of cost per unit. And you see that in other parts of tech as well. Huawei is actually quite effective in telecoms, and even in chips, it's actually been able to get around a lot of these export controls from the US. Shein for fast fashion, ByteDance, and TikTok for social media. And so you have this natural evolution where first you're learning through FDI, and then eventually you start building your own firms that go global. I think that's the thing I'm hopeful we'll see starting to happen on a 5-10 year time horizon within Indian tech, is more startups and even established Indian firms genuinely competing in foreign markets. I think that's when that the innovation is real and you're actually on the technology frontier. You have some examples, you have Freshworks, I think Postman, Zoho, but they're very few and far between. And in terms of the big conglomerates, very, very few of them actually export much. They're mostly domestically focused. I think that's something where the government needs to, be very honest about, right? Are these companies actually productive and efficient if they're not competing in foreign markets? Are we protecting them too much? I think that's a risk. Outside of tech, I think the picture on jobs, which was the other thing we talked about, the labor market, to be honest, I don't think there's any silver bullet here. I think the world has gotten more challenging, and I don't think there is any, silver bullet policy that India can pass that will, just create hundreds of millions of high quality jobs. It's going to be it's a slow slog. And one hypothesis that some people have raised recently, I think Sajid Chinoy of JPM wrote an op-ed on this recently, how the economy has shifted from being supply constrained to demand constrained. So over the last 10 years, the government's focus was building out the supply side. So that's infrastructure, reducing the cost of production, fixing the capital market so it's much easier to get access to financing. And I think they've been broadly successful on those two things, the physical infrastructure and then the financial sector. But the demand side is still weak. And part of that's about competitiveness. Can you compete on global markets and access foreign demand? Part of it's also just about domestic spending power and consumption. And maybe there's a case for finding ways to get more consumption power into people's pockets. Maybe you need to, rather than provide so many in-kind transfers. So India provides a lot of welfare through giving people things like, the cooking gas or, these, I guess, other welfare programs. why don't you give them money and then they will spend that, or the free grain program is the other big one. Why don't you give them money and they will spend on whatever they need the most, and maybe that will contribute to aggregate demand and could boost, the amount of good jobs in the economy. I think that's the other big challenge in question. So yeah, creating domestic companies that go global and then finding solutions around the labor market are the two of the things that I'm going to be very keen to see how things evolve. And I guess the third one is going back to what you asked in the very beginning about our stories recently on the political economy. Is this prime minister going to be able to build a consensus around reform that is honest about these problems and then tackles them? That's the other thing I'm very curious about. He's an extremely consequential figure, extremely interesting. We've not had a prime minister this powerful since, in terms of 3 consecutive full terms, potentially since Nehru. So is he going to live up to that? That's the other big question.
Right, Arjun, thank you, and really appreciate you taking time. And I hope that Prime Minister Modi lives up. It's the 3rd term. The people have voted. There's a coalition party. Yes, we are living in challenging times, but like you mentioned, the human capital expertise that we kind of investing in, I'm sure that's going to pay off. Demographic dividend. Exciting times, and I hope things fall in place. And really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you, Arjun. Really appreciate this.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie. Had a good time.